There is a story that has survived for more than 2,000 years, a story that tells of a place in the dry lands of Mesopotamia, where the heat could scorch the earth, and water was more precious than almost anything else, where there once stood a garden so green that it astonished the entire ancient world. Not an ordinary garden. It was a garden built in multiple levels, great trees growing high above the ground, bushes covering the stone terraces, and water brought up from below, flowing through the higher levels and cascading downward, creating a living stream in a land that was otherwise desperately thirsty. From a distance, one could imagine that an entire green mountain had risen in the middle of the city, a place where nature itself seemed to have been lifted into the sky by human hands. Later generations would call it the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. It was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a structure that, if it truly existed, would be proof that more than 2,000 years ago, human beings were capable of things that even today can seem almost impossible. But there is one problem, a very big problem. We are not certain that it ever existed in Babylon. Some researchers have even raised an even more unsettling question. Did the Hanging Gardens of Babylon actually exist at all? Because when archaeologists came to Babylon, they did not find a structure clear enough to point to and say, "This is the Hanging Gardens." There are no enormous garden terraces still standing. No clearly identifiable irrigation system associated with the gardens. No simple inscription saying, "This is the famous garden that later generations would call the Hanging Gardens." And the strangest part is this: Babylon is not a city about which we know almost nothing. Quite the opposite. Babylon is one of the best documented cities of the ancient world. Its kings left behind monumental works, walls, gates, temples, palaces, inscriptions written on clay tablets. The Babylonians had a highly developed tradition of record keeping. So why would a structure considered one of the greatest wonders of their civilization leave behind almost no clear confirmation? This is where the story begins to become truly strange. Because if we cannot find it, we are forced to ask, are we searching for a structure that really existed? Or are we searching for a story that has been changed over thousands of years? Let us try to turn the clock back. Imagine that you are standing in Mesopotamia more than 2,000 years ago. There are no glass skyscrapers, no electric water pumps, no modern machinery, no enormous construction cranes. All around you is a land where water is precious. The Euphrates River flows through the region, bringing life. But beyond the irrigated areas, the climate is harsh. And in a world like this, creating a green garden was already an extraordinary achievement. But according to the legend, the Babylonians did not stop there. They raised the garden into the air, one level at a time, so that trees could grow on massive architectural platforms. And then they brought water up to those higher levels. The water flowed downward. The soil was irrigated. The plants continued to live. A system that seemed almost completely opposite to nature. Instead of allowing the garden to grow upward from the ground, human beings appeared to have lifted an entire piece of nature onto artificial structures. If that really happened, it was more than just a garden. It was a statement that human beings could make nature live according to their will. But this is where the paradox appears. The descriptions of the Hanging Gardens are extraordinary, yet the archaeological evidence at Babylon does not match their fame. And when a mystery has no direct evidence, researchers begin looking elsewhere. There was another city, a city that once stood at the heart of the Assyrian Empire. Its name was Nineveh. Today, the name may not be familiar to everyone, but in the ancient world, Nineveh was one of the most powerful cities in the region, and something very interesting has been discovered there. Images and descriptions of gardens built within a complex architectural system. Trees growing in tiers, water being brought to them, large-scale irrigation works, and most importantly, some of these descriptions contain details that remind us of the very hanging gardens described by Greek and Roman writers. Suddenly, the question changes. It is no longer, where are the Hanging Gardens of Babylon? It becomes, what if they were not in Babylon? What if the ancient stories simply got the location wrong? What if a real structure once existed, But through centuries of oral tradition, translation, and written records, its name became associated with a different city. It may sound hard to believe, but think about how information was transmitted more than 2,000 years ago. There was no internet, no satellites, no digital maps, no cameras. One person saw a structure. That person told someone else. The second person told a third. The third person wrote it down. Another generation translated it. Another region continued telling the story. And so on. A small detail could change. The name of a king could be confused. The name of a city could be replaced. A garden high above the ground could become a hanging garden. A multi-level structure could become a wonder that seemed to float in the air. And after thousands of years, we find ourselves at the end of that chain of transmission, trying to determine what was the original truth. There is one particularly fascinating theory, that the story we call the Hanging Gardens of Babylon may actually have been connected to Nineveh. If so, the person behind the structure may not have been the one we usually think of. The name most commonly associated with the Hanging Gardens is Nebuchadnezzar II, the famous king of Babylon. But in Nineveh, another figure appears, Sennacherib, an Assyrian king who commissioned numerous monumental projects and developed remarkable water management systems. If this theory is correct, then the entire history of the Hanging Gardens may have been turned upside down. Babylon may not have been the place where they were built. Nebuchadnezzar may not have been the person behind them. And the name Hanging Gardens of Babylon may simply be the name history became accustomed to using after many centuries. But now we face an even more difficult question. If Sennacherib really built such a massive garden, how could he have supplied it with water? This is where the story becomes truly astonishing, because building a garden on the ground is difficult enough, but building a garden high above the ground and keeping it green in a dry land is an entirely different engineering problem. Plants need water, soil needs water, roots need water, and if there were large trees, the amount of water required would have been enormous. It would have had to be supplied continuously, day after day, not once, not twice, but year after year, perhaps even for decades. So how did people in the ancient world accomplish it? Did they have a kind of pump that we have not yet discovered? Did they use water wheels, human labor, animal power? Or had they already understood a hydraulic principle that we usually assume appeared much later? And if they truly managed to do it, then there is something we are forced to reconsider. Perhaps we have underestimated the engineering abilities of ancient civilizations, because a garden like this could not have existed through imagination alone. It required architecture, it required irrigation, it required materials, it required labor, and most importantly, it required a system capable of operating continuously. A system in which, if even one link stopped working, the entire garden could begin to die. And this is where the story of the Hanging Gardens changes from a beautiful legend into one of the most fascinating engineering puzzles of the ancient world. But before we explore how ancient people might have lifted water to such heights, we need to answer another question. A question that seems to concern nothing more than language, but may have completely changed the way humanity imagines the Hanging Gardens. What did hanging actually mean? Because it is entirely possible that the Hanging Gardens were never hanging in the way we imagine them. And if that is true, the image of this wonder that we have seen in books for generations may be completely different from reality. So what did the Hanging Gardens really look like? That is the question we will continue to explore in the next part. Was the garden not really hanging? Try closing your eyes and imagining the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. Perhaps the first image that comes to mind is a series of gardens suspended in mid-air. Layers of greenery extending out from a massive structure, the roots of the trees seemingly never touching the ground, water cascading down from above in streams. And below, an ancient city standing in the middle of the hot, dry lands of Mesopotamia. A scene that seems almost impossible to exist. But there is a problem. That image may never have been accurate. Perhaps the Hanging Gardens were not hanging in the way we understand the word today. There were no bridges floating in the sky, no chunks of earth suspended in mid-air, no gardens hanging from ropes or mysterious structures. Instead, It may have simply been a system of gardens built high above the ground, and a small difference in the way an ancient word was understood may have transformed a multi-level architectural structure into one of the most mysterious wonders in history, from hanging to high above the ground. When ancient Greek and Roman writers described the hanging gardens, they used words that could carry meanings associated with hanging, overhanging, or being elevated. Today, when we hear the word hanging, we immediately think of something that does not touch the ground. A hanging lamp, a suspension bridge, something suspended in the air. But ancient languages did not always work that simply. A structure built on elevated levels could also give the impression of hanging above the people looking at it. Imagine standing at the base of a massive structure. In front of you is not a garden spread horizontally across the ground. Instead, there are layers of architecture stacked one above another. The first level, the second level, the third level. And on each level are soil, trees, and flowering plants. The upper levels extend outward beyond the ones below them. From a distance, the vegetation could conceal much of the walls and columns underneath. To the naked eye, you might get the impression that the entire garden was floating in midair. But in reality, it would still be standing on an extremely solid structure. If this is how the hanging gardens were actually built, it completely changes our image of the wonder. It is no longer a supernatural miracle. It becomes an engineering achievement. And sometimes, a structure can seem even more miraculous when we do not understand how it was built. An artificial mountain in the middle of the city. Try imagining a structure that looks like an artificial mountain. But instead of bare rock, it is covered in greenery. Each level could be its own garden. Layers of soil placed on strong architectural platforms. Walls holding the soil in place. Columns carrying the weight. Arches distributing the load. And at the very top, a system delivering water. A structure like this would not need to float. It would only need to be built high enough. But immediately, we encounter another problem. Soil is extremely heavy. Water is even heavier. And a mature tree is certainly not lightweight. If you place a large amount of soil on an architectural level, the weight increases dramatically. If you then saturate all that soil with water, the weight becomes even greater. So how could ancient builders prevent the lower levels from collapsing under the pressure? This is where architecture becomes critical. The problem of soil, water, and stone. An ordinary garden only needs soil, but a garden built high above the ground needs much more. It needs a foundation. It needs a load-bearing system. It needs materials capable of resisting the weight of soil and water. And most importantly, it needs water control. Because water does not only keep plants alive, it can also destroy a structure. If water seeps through the foundation, it can weaken the materials. If water accumulates, it can create pressure. If the soil is not properly contained, it can slide downward. And if one level is damaged, the levels above it may also be affected. So for a multi-level garden to survive for a long time, the builders could not simply think, how do we grow plants? They had to think, how do we make the entire structure live alongside the plants? That is a completely different problem. When architecture and nature become one, the most remarkable thing about a garden like this is not the number of plants. It is the way the entire structure would have been designed so that the plants became part of it. The walls were not simply walls. The foundations were not simply foundations. The levels were not simply places for people to stand. Everything had to serve one purpose: to create an environment where plants could survive for a long time on an artificial structure. Imagine garden terraces extending outward from one another. On each level is a layer of soil deep enough for roots to grow. The outer walls hold the soil in place. Below them are load-bearing structures. And above, a continuous irrigation system operates. From the outside, vegetation would cover much of the architecture. People standing below might not even see what was supporting it all. They would see only green. They would see the shade of trees. They would see water. And they would see something that seemed impossible in the middle of a dry and unforgiving land. Perhaps that very feeling helped create the legend. But water was the greatest secret of EOO. Building a single garden level was difficult. Building many levels was even harder. But getting water to the highest level was the real challenge. Imagine you have a garden built on a structure dozens of feet above the ground. You are standing below. The water source is down at a lower level. The plants are above. Water does not naturally flow upward. It only flows downward. That is one of the most basic effects of gravity. So how could ancient people make water move in the opposite direction? They had to create another force strong enough to lift it. And this is where some fascinating theories about ancient technology begin to appear. The water screw. One possibility often mentioned is a type of water screw. Imagine a long tube. Inside the tube is a spiral mechanism resembling a gigantic spring. When the mechanism turns, water is trapped within the spaces between the spiral, and with each rotation, the water is gradually lifted upward. No electricity, no modern engine, just continuous rotational motion. Today, the principle is easy to understand, but placing it in the context of thousands of years ago raises a major question. Could ancient people have known how to use this principle before it was clearly documented in the history of science? This is where we have to be very careful. It is entirely possible that a technique existed before a scientist formally described it. But that does not mean we have solid evidence that it was actually used for the Hanging Gardens. And that gap between possible and proven is where historical mysteries live. Water wheels. Another possibility seems somewhat simpler. A large wheel. Around the wheel are a series of buckets. As the wheel turns, the buckets at the bottom collect water. Then they move upward. When they reach the highest point, the water is emptied into a channel. From there, the water can be carried higher or distributed to other areas. If the water needed to be raised even farther, multiple systems could be connected. The first level, then the second, then the third, like a chain of links. Each system lifting the water another step. And with enough workers, animals, or a suitable source of power, a significant amount of water could potentially be raised. But that brings us to another problem. Who would operate all of it? The garden could not live on its own. An ordinary garden can depend heavily on rainfall, but a garden built in a dry environment depends on people. If the water system stops, the plants begin to wilt. If the plants die, the soil loses stability. If the soil erodes, the structure could be affected. If the irrigation channels become blocked, the upper levels would be the first to suffer. That means the Hanging Gardens, if they ever existed, were not a structure that only needed to be built once. They were a living system. Someone would have had to inspect it every day. Water would have been needed every day. Someone would have had to deal with damage every day. The irrigation channels may have needed repairs. Water lifting mechanisms may have needed replacement. Leaks would have had to be checked. Trees would have needed pruning. Soil would have needed reinforcement. And the entire system would have had to keep functioning. In other words, the hardest part may not have been building the Hanging Gardens. It may have been keeping them alive. And this may be the key to the mystery. Think about this. A massive stone structure can survive for thousands of years. Even after people leave, the stone remains. A statue can break, but the pieces of stone are still there. A temple can collapse, but its foundations may still be found. A garden is different. It needs water. It needs soil. It needs plants. It needs maintenance. And when the system stops working, the very things that once created its beauty may become the reason it disappears. The plants die. The soil dries out. The water stops flowing. The materials begin to deteriorate. The walls crack. The terraces collapse. And eventually, what was once a massive garden could become nothing more than a pile of earth and bricks. After several centuries, people might no longer recognize what it once was. After thousands of years, there might not even be any obvious evidence that a garden ever existed there. And this is what makes the Hanging Gardens different from many other ancient wonders. They may have been made from materials that were particularly vulnerable to disappearing. A wonder that could erase its own traces. Imagine one day, the irrigation system stops working. No more water flows. The great trees begin to wither. The bushes slowly die. The roots no longer hold the soil together. Wind blows across the garden terraces. Rare rains fall. Water seeps into places that were once protected. The bricks begin to weaken. A wall cracks. One level collapses, then another. Not everything disappears overnight, but little by little. Year after year, generation after generation, until a structure that once astonished the entire ancient world is reduced to nothing more than a mound of earth rising from the middle of the city. People living generations later might walk across it without ever knowing that a wonder once stood beneath their feet. And if a new civilization built on top of it, the older remains could become buried even deeper. This is why the absence of an intact structure does not necessarily prove that it never existed. But it also cannot automatically prove that it did. That is the delicate boundary between archaeology and legend. The question remains. We began with a garden. Then we discovered that perhaps it was never truly hanging. Then we discovered that its location may not have been Babylon. Then another question emerged about who built it. And finally, we were forced to confront an engineering problem. How could ancient people have raised enough water high enough to sustain a massive garden? Each answer seems to make the mystery a little smaller. But at the same time, it opens another mystery that is even larger. And perhaps the most astonishing part has not even appeared yet. Because if a multi-level garden really existed, it would not only need a system for lifting water, it would also need a way to keep the water from destroying the very structure that supported the garden. Remember, soil is heavy, water is heavy, and mud brick is particularly vulnerable to water if it is not properly protected. So, what did the ancient builders do to prevent tons of soil and water from destroying their garden? How did they create a waterproofing system? How were the terraces constructed? And why do some ancient descriptions lead modern researchers to believe that beneath those gardens may have been an architectural system far more complex than we might imagine? If we can answer that question, we may come one step closer to imagining what the Hanging Gardens really looked like. And perhaps we will also understand why a wonder celebrated for thousands of years could almost completely disappear from the surface of the earth. The green structure in the desert. There is something we often forget when we look at the wonders of the ancient world. We see the result, but we rarely think about the problems people of that time had to solve before they could create that result. A massive pyramid is not just a collection of stones. An ancient city is not just a series of walls. And if the Hanging Gardens really existed, they were not simply trees growing on elevated terraces. Behind the greenery that ancient people once saw, there must have been a massive system. A system that may have combined architecture, soil, water, plants, and human labor into a single structure. And the more we think about it, the more we begin to realize something astonishing. Maybe what made the Hanging Gardens a wonder was not the trees. It was everything underneath them. A garden could not be built like an ordinary house. Imagine that you want to build a house. You put up the walls, build the roof, create the foundation. Then you bring people and furniture inside. But if you want to turn the entire roof into a garden, everything changes immediately. You need soil, a lot of soil. You need water, a lot of water. You need trees. And the larger the trees, the deeper their roots need to go. The thicker the soil, the greater the weight. As water soaks into the soil, the weight increases even further. And if it rains, the entire system has to carry even more water. So an elevated garden could not be designed like a room. It had to be engineered from the very beginning. Every level, every wall, every load-bearing point, every water channel. If even one part was wrong, the entire structure could be put at risk. That is why when we talk about the Hanging Gardens, we should not simply imagine a garden. Imagine instead a massive architectural structure whose trees were only the part we could see. Soil, the heaviest thing people often overlook. There is an interesting paradox. When we look at a garden, the first thing we usually notice is the vegetation. But for the builders, the trees may not have been the biggest problem. The soil was. A small tree does not need much soil. But a large tree needs a layer deep enough for its roots to develop. If there were hundreds of trees, the amount of soil required would become enormous. And if the garden was built high above the ground, all that weight had to be carried by the structure underneath. Imagine placing a thick layer of soil on a rooftop, then watering it, then planting trees, then watering it again, every day, every month, every year. The pressure does not disappear. It is always there. And because of that, the structure would have had to be designed to carry that load continuously. This may be one of the reasons why the Hanging Gardens, if they truly existed, must have been a structure with a very unusual design. The garden terraces. Instead of building one enormous platform, the ancient builders may have divided the space into multiple levels. The lower levels supported the ones above. Columns and arches distributed the weight. Walls held the soil in place. Different areas may have been used for different types of plants, and each level could have been connected by pathways, bridges, or other architectural passages. From below, you might see a massive wall covered in vegetation, but from above, you could see one layer of garden after another. One level, then another, then another. Continuing upward. This is what made the Hanging Gardens so distinctive, because they did not simply use space horizontally. They used vertical space. Human beings transformed vertical architecture into an ecosystem, and this idea is actually very close to things we still do today. Rooftop gardens, green balconies, living walls, urban agriculture, multi-level gardens. Today, we can build these things using steel, concrete, and modern technology. But if an ancient civilization truly achieved something similar with far simpler materials, it would be an extraordinary accomplishment. But there was a silent enemy: water. Water is what keeps the garden alive, but water can also be what destroys the structure. This is the greatest paradox of the Hanging Gardens. For the plants to survive, there must be water. But the more water there is, the more the structure must defend itself against water infiltration. Imagine a layer of soil sitting on top of an architectural foundation. Every day, water is added. Some of it is absorbed by the plants, some evaporates, but some continues to seep downward. Without protection, water will find its way through even the smallest cracks. At first, nothing may seem to happen. A little moisture, a tiny crack, a small section of weakened material. But over time, water can completely alter a structure. And if the primary material was mud brick, the danger would be even greater. Mud brick and the fragility of a wonder. Mesopotamia was famous for using bricks made from clay and mud. It was a material well suited to an environment where large quantities of stone were not always easy to obtain. It could be shaped, produced in large quantities, and used to build quickly. But it had one major weakness: water. Water can weaken clay-based materials if they are not properly protected. And this creates an almost perfect paradox at the heart of the Hanging Gardens. A structure that depends on water to survive must also protect itself from the destructive power of water. If the waterproofing system works, the garden can survive. If it fails, water begins to penetrate. One layer breaks down, then the layer beneath it, then the load-bearing structures. And over time, the structure begins to weaken from within, not in the form of an immediate collapse, but quietly, slowly, almost impossible to notice in the early stages. A structure can die from the inside. Imagine a wall. From the outside, it still looks completely normal. There are no obvious signs of serious damage, but inside, water has already seeped through. The material begins to lose its strength. Weak points appear. One day, part of the wall cracks. People repair it. But if the underlying cause remains, water continues to get inside. New cracks appear. Then another level begins to weaken. The frightening part is that this process can take years. One generation may not notice the problem. 2 generations may not recognize it either. But after hundreds of years, small weaknesses accumulate into major deterioration. And this is one of the ways a wonder can disappear. Not because of a battle, not because of an explosion, but because of time. But the ancient builders may have known how to fight it. For an elevated garden to function, the builders had to find a way to keep soil and water where they belonged. A layer of soil could not simply be placed directly on top of brick. If water seeped downward, the structure would be affected. So there may have needed to be intermediate layers. Layers designed to block water. Layers designed to drain it. Structures designed to hold the soil in place. Walls surrounding each level. We cannot say with certainty exactly how every detail of a structure that has not been definitively identified was built. But in principle, any large garden constructed high above the ground would have faced these same problems. And those problems are what make the story so fascinating. Because if the Hanging Gardens really existed, their builders did not merely need to know how to grow plants. They had to understand how water moves, how soil carries weight, how roots grow, how materials respond to moisture, and most importantly, how all of those things could work together. A garden may have been a massive hydraulic system. Let us return to the water. The water source may have been below, but the plants were above. The water had to be lifted, then distributed. It could not simply be poured into one place. If that happened, the level closest to the water source would become too wet, while the levels farther away would remain dry. So the water had to be distributed evenly. Perhaps through small channels, perhaps through trenches, perhaps through conduits built into the structure itself. And if the garden had multiple levels, the water had to be regulated at each height. It would be similar to a transportation system. Water is the traffic, channels are the roads, the garden levels are the areas that need to be supplied. If one road is blocked, one area does not receive water. If one channel breaks, water may flood somewhere else. If the water lifting system stops, every level above it is affected. This is no longer a simple garden, it is an engineering system. And that system needed people. There is something often overlooked when we talk about the wonders of the ancient world. We usually ask, who built it? But an equally important question is, who operated it? A large structure needs people to build it, but a complex structure needs people to operate it for a long time. If the Hanging Gardens really existed, there may have been people whose specific responsibility was water, people who cared for the plants, people who repaired the architecture, people who inspected the terraces, people who operated the water lifting system, people who dealt with blocked channels, and all of them had to work together because the garden could not take care of itself. One day without water, the plants might survive. A few days, there might still be hope. But if the system remained inactive for too long, life would begin to disappear. First the most sensitive plants, then the bushes, then the ground cover. Eventually, the soil would become dry. And once the plants died, the entire system would begin losing one of its most important protective elements. The plants were not just decoration. This is a fascinating point. We often think plants were planted simply to make the garden beautiful. But in a system like the Hanging Gardens, plants may have played several other roles. Roots help hold soil together. Leaves provide shade. Vegetation reduces the direct impact of sunlight. Plants also participate in the water cycle. And of course, they created the very image that made the garden a wonder. Without the plants, the structure would simply be layers of architecture. But when vegetation covered them, the boundary between architecture and nature disappeared. Stone became a foundation for life. Walls became green surfaces. Architectural terraces became gardens, and the entire structure seemed almost alive. Perhaps that was what astonished the ancient people most. Not simply that they were looking at a massive structure, but that they were looking at nature growing directly from something human beings had built. A green oasis in a dry city. Imagine Babylon or Nineveh from a distance, an ancient city with massive walls, dusty roads, structures made from earth and brick, surrounded by a hot, dry landscape. And then, in the middle of all of it, there appears a green oasis. Tall trees, shade, water, flowers, and layers of gardens rising above one another. Someone approaching the city from outside might see it before getting close. And the nearer they came, the more they could hear the sound of water. In a world where water meant life, a place like this would surely have made a powerful impression, especially if it had been built by a king. Because then, the garden was not simply a place to grow plants. It was also a symbol of power, a way of telling his subjects and visitors from distant lands, we can create life even where nature itself is unwilling to provide it. The wonder was not just for beauty. This is what makes the Hanging Gardens potentially far more significant than an ordinary garden. In the ancient world, architecture was often a language of power. The larger the walls, the more intimidating the city. The taller the temple, the greater the religious authority. The more magnificent the palace, the more powerful the king wanted to appear. A massive garden in the middle of a dry land could carry a similar message. There was no need for thousands of soldiers, no need to carve a declaration into stone. All that was necessary was for people to see an unbelievable expanse of green. a green world created through human power. And if it truly existed, the Hanging Gardens may have been one of the most subtle displays of power in the ancient world. But the more perfect IT was, the more fragile IT became. This is the final paradox of this part. The more complex a system is, the more things can go wrong. A simple garden may only need rain, but a multi-level garden requires an entire network. A wheel breaks, a channel becomes blocked, a wall cracks, a waterproofing layer fails, a maintenance team disappears, a war begins, a dynasty collapses. If just one of those links is broken, the system can begin to weaken. And this may be the key to understanding something very strange. Why could such a magnificent wonder disappear almost completely? Because some structures are built to resist time. But there are also structures that can survive, only as long as people continue taking care of them. The Hanging Gardens may have belonged to the second kind. And if that is true, then their disappearance may not have been a single event. There was no exact day when people woke up and said, "The Hanging Gardens are gone." They may have died very slowly. The plants died first, the water stopped flowing. The soil began to dry, the architectural layers were neglected. Rain and wind continued the process. Then people came. They dismantled whatever could still be used. They took the bricks, they took the stone. They built new structures. The city changed, generations changed, memories changed, and eventually, a wonder that had once astonished the entire ancient world survived only in stories. But that leads us to an even more difficult question. If the Hanging Gardens really disappeared this way, why have modern archaeologists still been unable to find clear enough remains to confirm that they existed? Were all traces truly erased? Or are we looking in the wrong place? And if we are looking in the wrong place, then the evidence from Nineveh may be telling us an entirely different story. A story about an Assyrian king, a massive water management system, and a green structure that may have been mistaken by later generations for the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. In the next part, we will dive into the greatest mystery of all, why Nineveh has become such a compelling candidate, and what evidence has made the theory that the Hanging Gardens were actually in Nineveh so fascinating. Nineveh. Could this city have hidden the Hanging Gardens? There is a moment in the story of the Hanging Gardens when everything begins to change. Until this point, we have been looking toward Babylon. Babylon is the name that has been associated with the garden for thousands of years. Babylon is where the ancient stories have led us. Babylon is the city that most people immediately think of when they hear the words Hanging Gardens. But then, researchers began looking north, and there, in the lands that once belonged to the Assyrian Empire, another city emerged. Nineveh, a city once so powerful that it could strike fear across the entire region. A city once surrounded by enormous walls. A city that once contained vast palaces, and most importantly, a city with evidence suggesting that the Assyrians were deeply invested in moving water over long distances. If the Hanging Gardens really existed, this may not be a minor detail. It could be the biggest clue of all. Nineveh, the city of water. Imagine standing outside Nineveh at the height of the Assyrian Empire. Before you are massive walls. Behind them are palaces, temples, streets, and the structures of an empire at the peak of its power. But there is something especially important to this city: water. Not just water for drinking, not just water for people, but water for the entire city. For trees, for agriculture, for gardens, for the places where people lived. And because of this, the Assyrians developed remarkable irrigation systems. They built channels, they redirected water, they controlled its flow, and they brought water from distant areas to places where it was needed. This is extremely important, because when we think about an ancient civilization, we often imagine people living entirely at the mercy of nature. Rain came, and there was water. The river rose, and there was water. The dry season arrived, and they simply had to wait. But the Assyrian irrigation works suggest something very different. People did not simply wait for water. They found ways to control it. And once you have the ability to control water, the idea of a massive garden in a dry environment no longer seems completely impossible. A suspicious coincidence now placed the two cities side by side, Babylon and Nineveh. Babylon has the long-standing tradition connecting it to the Hanging Gardens. But direct evidence of such a garden remains controversial. Nineveh, on the other hand, has evidence of large-scale irrigation systems and imagery associated with gardens. Suddenly, a question appears. Could the ancient writers have gotten the location wrong? Or perhaps more accurately, could we have misunderstood the way the ancient records were written? This is not an unreasonable question, because much of what we know about the Hanging Gardens does not come from an architectural blueprint created by the builders themselves. We do not have a complete set of engineering records, no architectural drawings, no intact structure to compare against. What remains are mostly descriptions passed down through people who lived in different eras, and when a story travels across multiple cultures, it can change. A city can be remembered incorrectly. A king can become associated with a structure that actually belonged to someone else. And a structure can eventually take the name of the more famous place, rather than the place where it actually existed. The arrival of Sennacherib. This is where another name enters the story, Sennacherib. If Nebuchadnezzar I is the familiar figure when we talk about Babylon, Sennacherib was one of the most important kings of Assyria. He ruled over a vast empire, and during his reign, Nineveh was greatly developed. Major construction projects were undertaken, palaces were expanded, the city was transformed, and its water systems were developed. But what makes Sennacherib especially interesting is not simply the fact that he built things. It is the way he described his achievements. His irrigation projects were presented as accomplishments worthy of pride. Water was brought in from distant regions, channels were constructed, water flow was controlled, and gardens were created. If we look only at these facts, they may not be enough to say, this is the Hanging Gardens. But they establish something important, a technological environment in which a structure like the Hanging Gardens would have been possible. And that is the key distinction. We do not have to prove immediately that Sennacherib built the Hanging Gardens. We only need to recognize that the Assyrians possessed the knowledge and resources necessary to carry out highly sophisticated irrigation projects. A picture may be telling a different story. Imagine researchers discover an image of a garden, not a small garden, but a green space arranged across multiple architectural levels. There are trees, there is water, there are supporting structures. If you looked at that image by itself, you might think, this is the Hanging Gardens. But the problem is, an image like that cannot tell us where it was located. It cannot say, I am in Babylon, or I am in Nineveh. To determine that, we have to combine multiple forms of evidence: architecture, texts, water systems, location, time period, and the history of the kings involved. This is how archaeology works. It is not simply about finding one object and declaring that the mystery has been solved. It is about assembling hundreds of small pieces until a picture begins to emerge. And in the case of the Hanging Gardens, that picture is still incomplete. But there is one very important detail. If the Hanging Gardens were in Babylon, why have the Babylonians not left behind clear evidence of them? This is one of the most difficult questions, because Nebuchadnezzar I was famous for his building projects. He left behind extensive evidence of the construction and expansion of Babylon. He was proud of his city. He recorded major works, religious structures, walls, gates, building projects. But when we search for a clear description of a massive garden, the picture becomes much less certain. This does not mean the Hanging Gardens definitely did not exist, but it creates a gap. And throughout history, gaps are often where the strongest theories emerge. Another possibility, perhaps the Hanging Gardens really did exist in Babylon, but were known by another name. Perhaps they were part of a palace. Perhaps they were not considered a separate structure. Perhaps the relevant records were lost. Or perhaps they really were somewhere else. And if the Nineveh theory is correct, then a historical mix-up may have occurred. A garden in Nineveh became known to people from outside the city. The story was passed on, the name of the city changed, and eventually it became the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. But why Babylon? Perhaps because Babylon had become a more powerful symbol in the imagination of the ancient world. A legendary city, a wealthy city, a city of enormous monuments. A name that was easier to remember, and sometimes History does not preserve the exact location. It preserves the most famous name. But Nineveh had something Babylon could not easily explain: its water system. Imagine a large city that needs water, not simply a river flowing nearby, but water delivered to specific areas. To accomplish that, the Assyrians had to build channels. Some of these waterworks were enormous. They crossed difficult terrain. They passed through different landscapes, and they brought water to where it was needed. This proves one thing: they understood that water could be transported through engineering. That is an extremely important foundation, because if you want to build a garden high above the ground, you need water. If you want to lift water, you need energy. If you want to maintain the garden, you need a system. And if you want that system to keep working for years, you need an entire organization. Assyria had those things: a powerful state, a large labor force, the ability to build on a massive scale, and knowledge of irrigation, something even more remarkable. Think about the distance. If the water source was far from the city, then every mile of channel would have presented a challenge. The terrain was uneven. The slope had to be calculated. The water could not flow too quickly, but it could not flow too slowly either. If the slope was wrong, the water could overflow. If the channel became blocked, the flow would stop. If the ground was unstable, the structure could fail. And yet the Assyrians were able to construct large water delivery systems. This raises a new question. If they could bring water from distant places into the city, could they also have raised water into elevated gardens? A definite answer? Not yet. But the technological possibility clearly becomes much harder to dismiss. And this is where the story becomes fascinating. On one side is legend, on the other is archaeological evidence. Between them, there is a gap, and inside that gap, we have to assemble the pieces. The first piece, there are ancient descriptions of a massive garden. The second piece, Babylon is famous for the story of the Hanging Gardens. The third piece, Babylon has not provided completely convincing archaeological evidence of such a garden. The fourth piece, Nineveh has remarkable irrigation works. The fifth piece, Sennacherib placed particular importance on water systems and gardens. The sixth piece, there are images and descriptions that have led some researchers to imagine a multi-level garden. Put all of these pieces together, and a theory begins to take shape. Perhaps the Hanging Gardens never belonged to Babylon. Perhaps they belonged to Nineveh. But there is still a problem, a very important one. If Nineveh really was the location of the garden, why have we still not been able to find it with certainty? The buried city. Nineveh was once an enormous city. But the Assyrian Empire did not last forever. Power shifted, wars broke out, the city was attacked, the empire collapsed, and Nineveh was eventually abandoned. A city that had once been the center of power became a ruin. Time covered it with layer after layer of earth. Structures collapsed, materials were taken away. New buildings appeared elsewhere. The city's name gradually disappeared from human memory. And then, thousands of years later, archaeologists began digging down. Layer by layer, the earth was removed. Walls were uncovered. Inscriptions appeared. Piece by piece, Nineveh returned to the world. But a garden is different from a wall. If it once existed, many of the things that made it what it was may have disappeared long ago. Trees died. Soil was disturbed. Water systems were destroyed. Materials were reused. And what remained might look like any other structure. The wonder may have been right in front of us. This is one of the most fascinating paradoxes. Perhaps archaeologists did not fail to find the Hanging Gardens. Perhaps they found parts of them, but did not recognize what they were. Imagine discovering a system of walls, a few water channels, a foundation, a multi-level architectural area, but no trees, no flowing water, no sign identifying it, no inscriptions saying, "This is the Hanging Gardens." What would you call it? A palace? An irrigation structure? A garden? Part of the city? Archaeology does not always give us the answer. Sometimes it gives us only fragments, and human beings have to decide how to put them together. But if Sennacherib really stood behind this structure, then the story of the Hanging Gardens would become completely different. It would no longer simply be, a Babylonian king built a garden for his queen. It would become the story of an empire that turned irrigation engineering into a tool of power. A king who wanted to transform Nineveh into a great city, a dry landscape covered in greenery, water carried across enormous distances, gardens created through human power, and a structure that may have become a symbol of the ability to turn something that seemed almost impossible into reality. But we still cannot say for certain, and that is precisely what makes this story so fascinating. Because history does not always give us an answer. Sometimes it gives us a question, the biggest question. If the Hanging Gardens were in Nineveh, then one more thing needs to be explained. How could water have been raised high enough to irrigate multiple levels of gardens? Because channels can carry water from one place to another. But channels do not naturally carry water uphill. To raise water, you need another mechanism. It could have been human power, animal power, a wheel, a spiral mechanism, or perhaps a technology that we still do not fully understand. And if the builders of Nineveh really solved this problem, they may have created an extremely sophisticated water lifting system, a system that could operate day after day, year after year, keeping an enormous garden from dying. And this is where we return to the question we asked at the very beginning. How could ancient people have lifted water toward the sky? Did they use a principle that we would later associate with famous inventions? Or are we trying to view ancient engineering through the eyes of the modern world? And if the answer lies in wheels, spirals, and the labor of thousands of people, then the Hanging Gardens may not have been a miracle. They may have been the result of something even more astonishing, human intelligence. But to turn such a system into reality, you needed more than water, more than architecture, more than a king. You needed an enormous workforce, builders, operators, gardeners, repair crews, and an empire powerful enough to sustain all of them. So, if the Hanging Gardens truly existed, how many people, how much water, and how much labor did it take to keep them alive? And more importantly, how long could a structure like this survive after the people who built it were gone? That will be the next mystery. Because perhaps what killed the Hanging Gardens was not war. Perhaps it was simply the fact that no one was left to care for them. When the wonder began to die. Imagine a morning in an ancient city. The sun has just risen. The city walls are beginning to heat beneath the sunlight. High above, on the terraces of a massive garden, the trees are still green. Water is still flowing through the channels. The gardeners are still carrying out their familiar tasks. Perhaps no one thinks that one day, all of this will disappear. Not today, not tomorrow, perhaps not even within a single lifetime. But little by little, the wonder begins to die. Not in the way we usually imagine. There is no massive explosion, no single moment when the entire structure collapses. No one standing nearby to record. Today, the Hanging Gardens disappeared. It may have vanished much more slowly. A dynasty weakens. A group of workers leaves. A water channel is no longer repaired. A wall is no longer reinforced. A garden is no longer maintained. And from that moment, the process of disappearance begins. A garden that depended on people. Think about a natural forest. If humans leave, the forest can continue to survive. Rain still falls. Trees continue to grow. Seeds continue to sprout. Animals continue to reproduce. Nature can sustain itself. But a garden built high above the ground is different. It is not a completely natural ecosystem. It is a system created by human beings. Water has to be brought in. Soil has to be held in place. Plants have to be cared for. Damaged structures have to be repaired. Water channels have to be inspected. If such a garden really existed, it may have been like a gigantic machine. But instead of gears, it had trees. Instead of oil, it needed water. Instead of fuel, it needed human labor. And a machine only works as long as someone operates it. That was its greatest weakness. The more complex the wonder, the more dependent it became on the civilization that created it, when an empire begins to weaken. Now look at the bigger picture. A garden cannot be separated from the city. A city cannot be separated from the state. And the state cannot be separated from power. When a king was powerful, he could mobilize thousands of people. He could collect taxes. He could assign builders. He could provide materials. He could organize specialized teams. But when that power weakened, everything began to change. A canal needed repairs, but there were no longer enough workers. A water lifting wheel broke, but there was no one to replace it. A wall cracked, but no one was responsible for fixing it. The trees began to die, but there was no one left to water them. Each individual problem might seem small, but when they appeared at the same time, the system began to collapse. That is how a civilization can lose the achievements it once created. Not necessarily because it forgot how to build them, but simply because it no longer had the resources to maintain them. What happens when the water stops flowing? Let us return to the garden. One day, the water lifting system stops working. Perhaps a component breaks. Perhaps the source of power is gone. Perhaps war forces the people operating it to leave. At first, nothing seems too serious. The soil is still moist. Some plants still have water stored within them. But after a few days, the plants that need the most water begin to wilt. Then, their leaves change color. The young branches die first. The larger trees struggle to survive. But without water, even the strongest trees cannot survive forever. And when the trees die, something else begins to happen. The soil loses its stability. The roots that once held the soil in place are gone. Without them, the soil becomes easier to wash away. Rain can carry it downward. Wind can dry it out and scatter it. Gaps begin to appear. The garden terraces start losing their original structure. A garden that was once lush and green gradually becomes a mass of dry earth, when water changes from life-giving to destructive. But there is another paradox. When the water system stops working, the garden dies. But if the system is poorly designed or poorly maintained, water itself can destroy the structure. Imagine a heavy rainstorm. Water falls across the garden terraces. The soil absorbs it. Some flows downward. Some finds its way through tiny cracks. If the drainage system works properly, the water remains under control. But if a drainage channel becomes blocked, water begins to accumulate. And when water collects on an ancient structure, pressure increases. The soil becomes heavier. The materials become wetter. Old weaknesses become more serious. A tiny crack can widen. A wall can become unstable. Part of the foundation can sink. And once again, this does not have to happen in a single day. It only needs time. Time, the invisible destroyer. We often think ancient structures disappeared because of war, and war certainly could destroy cities. But war was not always necessary. Time itself is powerful enough. A brick does not need to be shattered immediately. It only needs to endure. Sun, rain, wind, temperature changes, moisture, and hundreds of years without maintenance. Little by little, it weakens. A structure that survives for 100 years because it is constantly maintained may not survive another 100 years once no one is left to repair it. And after several centuries, what was once built with great precision can become nothing more than a pile of broken materials. That is what makes time so frightening. It does not need to destroy everything at once. It only needs to keep acting. But war may have accelerated the process. If the Hanging Gardens were connected to Nineveh, then the story of their disappearance becomes even more complicated. Because Nineveh did not last forever. The Assyrian Empire was once immensely powerful, but every empire has its limits. Enemies appeared, wars were fought, alliances changed, the city was attacked, and eventually, Nineveh fell. A city that had once been the center of power was abandoned. For a structure that depended on constant maintenance like the Hanging Gardens, this could have been a disaster. Because even if war did not destroy the entire garden, it could destroy something even more important. The system that kept the garden alive. The people who operated it disappeared. The canals were no longer repaired. The water supply was interrupted. The trees died. The structure deteriorated. And a wonder may have died alongside the empire that created it. When the conquerors arrived, something else often happens to ancient cities. When a city is abandoned, it is not necessarily preserved like a museum. The people who come afterward need materials. They need bricks, they need stone, they need earth, they need anything that can be reused. And old structures become sources of raw materials. An ancient wall can be dismantled, its bricks carried away, its stones used in a new building. A foundation can become the foundation of another house. And little by little, the old city is taken apart. The sad part is, the people doing it may have no idea that they are destroying a wonder. To them, they are simply bricks, construction materials, There is no reason to preserve them. And after several generations, what was once a remarkable structure may have been scattered across the landscape, a wonder recycled. Imagine one wall of the Hanging Gardens. Long ago, it belonged to a palace. It supported the gardens. It had witnessed kings, gardeners, messengers, ceremonies, rainy seasons, dry seasons. But centuries later, someone removes a brick from that wall, carries it away, uses it to build a house. Another brick is used for another wall. Another section is crushed. Another is buried. Another is carried away by water. Another becomes part of the soil. There is no longer one single structure, only thousands of scattered pieces. And when archaeologists arrive thousands of years later, they do not see a wonder. They see the fragments of a city. This may be why we cannot find it. This brings us back to the original question. If the Hanging Gardens really existed, why is there almost no clear evidence of them today? Perhaps the answer is not a single secret. Perhaps it is a combination of many factors: water, time, war, the collapse of political power, lack of maintenance, the reuse of building materials, and most importantly, the transformation of the city itself. A structure may disappear not because it was completely destroyed in a single day, but because it was dismantled piece by piece over hundreds of years. But there is another problem. If everything were that simple, the story would be easy to explain. But the Hanging Gardens were not an ordinary structure. Ancient writers described them as a wonder. And that raises another question. Why did they tell stories about them? What did they see? Who did they hear the story from? And why did that story survive for so long? Perhaps they really saw a structure. Perhaps they heard stories from people who had actually been there. Perhaps they exaggerated. Or perhaps several different stories became mixed together. A garden in Babylon, a garden in Nineveh, the great irrigation works of Assyria, the palaces of Babylon, and over time, all of them became a single image, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. That possibility is what makes this mystery so unusual. Perhaps we are not searching for a single structure. Perhaps we are searching for the memory of several structures that became blended together. When history becomes memory, imagine a person living more than 2,000 years ago. He hears a merchant describing a distant city. The merchant says that there is a gigantic garden there. Trees grow on elevated terraces. Water flows down from above. The listener is amazed. He tells someone else. The second person adds a detail. The third leaves another detail out. Someone translates the story into another language. A historian writes it down. Hundreds of years later, someone else reads that account. And then, a story that may have begun with a real structure can become a legend. This is something that often happens with human memory. We do not preserve the past like a video camera, we retell it. And every time we retell it, something can change. So where is the truth? At this point, we may be left with three possibilities. Possibility 1. The Hanging Gardens really existed in Babylon, but the remains were destroyed or buried so deeply that we have not yet been able to identify them. Possibility 2. A similar garden really existed in Nineveh. Later, the story became associated with Babylon. Possibility 3. There was never a single Hanging Gardens in the way we imagine it. The story may be the result of several structures, several gardens, and several memories being combined over time. And for now, we cannot completely close the door on any of the possibilities. That is exactly what makes the Hanging Gardens a genuine mystery. Not because we know absolutely nothing, but because we know enough to ask the questions, yet not enough to give a final answer. But one thing is certain. Whether the Hanging Gardens stood in Babylon or Nineveh, whether they were built by Nebuchadnezzar or Sennacherib, whether they really looked like the images we see today or looked completely different, there is one thing we can see more clearly through what remains of the civilizations of Mesopotamia. The people of the ancient world were far more sophisticated than we often imagine. They could build enormous cities. They could control water. They could organize thousands of people. They could transform difficult landscapes into places filled with vegetation. And they could create structures impressive enough for stories about them to survive for thousands of years. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Hanging Gardens was not that trees once grew on elevated terraces. Perhaps it was that human beings once looked at a dry and difficult landscape and thought, we can make this place green. But the story is not over, because if we truly want to understand the Hanging Gardens, there is still one missing piece. What did they actually look like? Not the textbook illustrations, not modern paintings, not the CGI images we often see online, but if you had stood before them at the height of their glory, what would you have seen? A green mountain? A palace covered in trees? A series of elevated garden terraces? Or a structure completely different from the image modern imagination has created? And more importantly, if water really was lifted to those higher levels, how did the ancient people do it? Perhaps the answer lies in a simple but ingenious technology. A wheel, a system of buckets, a spiral mechanism, or a method we still do not fully understand. Because sometimes, ancient civilizations did not need complicated machines to accomplish extraordinary things. They only needed to understand how to use the simple laws of nature. And that may be the greatest secret of the Hanging Gardens. Not magic, not legend, but engineering. In the next part, we will dive into the problem of water, the element that may have determined the entire fate of the Hanging Gardens. How ancient people could have lifted water to great heights, what mechanisms they may have used, and whether a civilization more than 2,000 years ago truly had the ability to create such a massive hydraulic system. The secret of lifting water to the sky. Perhaps this is the most difficult question in the entire story of the Hanging Gardens. Not who built them, not were they in Babylon or Nineveh, but if those gardens really existed on elevated terraces, how did the ancient people bring water up there? Because trees can be planted, soil can be transported, walls can be built, but water always flows downward. It is a simple rule that anyone can observe. Pour water from a height and let it go, it will find its way down. So how could a civilization more than 2,000 years ago continuously lift water to elevated terraces? If they could not solve this problem, the Hanging Gardens could only exist in the imagination. But if they really did solve it, then we may be looking at one of the most astonishing engineering achievements of the ancient world. Water doesn't go up on its own. Let's try a very simple experiment. Take a container, fill it with water, place the container somewhere high, then make a hole near the bottom. The water flows down, nothing surprising. But if you want to move water from below to above, you have to act on it. You have to lift it, pump it, pull it, or use some kind of energy source. Today, all we have to do is turn on a water pump. A motor spins, water is drawn in, it is pushed through pipes, and within seconds, the water is on an upper floor. But the ancient world had no electric motors, no modern pumps, no industrial pipelines, no automated systems. So what could they do? The answer may be simpler than we think. Human power, buckets that never stop. Imagine dozens of people standing beside a water source. Each person holds a bucket. One person scoops, lifts it, pours it into a channel. The next person receives the water, lifts it again, pours it again, and so on. Water is gradually carried upward, step by step. It sounds almost too simple, and in reality, it could be surprisingly effective if enough people were involved. One bucket cannot move thousands of liters of water every hour, but hundreds of buckets and hundreds of people are a different story. This was something ancient civilizations were remarkably good at, replacing machines with human labor. What we solve today with engines, people in the ancient world could solve through organization. They didn't need one enormous machine. They only needed hundreds of people working together. But there was a problem. If a huge garden had to be watered every day, using buckets by hand would require an enormous amount of labor. Every day, every season, every year. People would have to perform the same task again and again. They couldn't stop for too long. They couldn't simply shut the system down, because plants don't wait. Dry soil means dead plants. And so, the ancient builders had every reason to search for a more efficient method. That may have been when water lifting devices began to appear. One of the simplest ideas was the wheel, the water wheel. Imagine a large wheel positioned near a water source. Attached to the wheel are buckets or compartments designed to hold water. As the wheel turns, the buckets at the bottom dip into the water. They fill up. Then the wheel continues to rotate. The bucket rises. When it reaches a higher position, the water is poured into a channel. Then the bucket rotates back down. It fills again, it rises again, it empties again, and the process continues. No person has to constantly climb up and down. No one has to manually lift every bucket. All that is needed is to keep the wheel moving. It is a simple idea. But if built on a large enough scale, it could lift a significant amount of water. And this is where ancient engineering becomes especially fascinating. Who made the wheel turn? The next question naturally appears. A wheel doesn't turn by itself. If there was no engine, what provided the movement? It could have been people. It could have been animals. A person or a group of people could walk in a circle. They pull the mechanism. The wheel turns. Water rises. One revolution, then another, then thousands more. It sounds exhausting. But remember, an ancient empire could mobilize enormous amounts of labor. For a king who wanted to create a garden capable of astonishing the entire world, the cost of human labor may not have been the greatest obstacle. Power itself was their source of energy. Something interesting about ancient civilizations. We often judge technology by the machines it produces, but ancient people had another kind of technology. The ability to organize human beings. Look at the great structures of the ancient world: pyramids, temples, fortifications, canals, roads. All of them required one thing: organize labor on a massive scale. If one person couldn't do it, they used 100 people. If 100 weren't enough, they used 1,000. And if 1,000 people needed to work together, the state created systems of management. So when we think about the Hanging Gardens, don't think only about a machine. Think about an entire city operating like a machine. Water lifted one level at a time. Perhaps the system didn't need to carry water directly from the ground all the way to the highest terrace. That would have been a much more difficult challenge. Instead, the process could have been divided into several stages. From the water source, the water was lifted to the first level. From the first level, it was lifted to the second, then the third. Each time, the water only had to be raised a smaller distance. That makes the problem easier. Imagine that you need to move a heavy object to the top of a 10-story building. If you have to lift it directly from the ground to the 10th floor, that's extremely difficult. But if you move it to the first floor, then the second, then the third, the work can be divided into smaller tasks. The same principle could apply to water. A multi-level system could have allowed the water to be raised gradually. And once the water reached the highest level, gravity became an ally again. Gravity, the enemy that suddenly became an ally. This is the most beautiful part of the problem. Human beings had to do the work of lifting the water. But once the water reached a sufficient height, they no longer needed to keep lifting it. They only had to open a path. The water would flow down on its own. From the highest terrace to the lower levels, through channels, through conduits, into different parts of the garden. So the system could be divided into two parts. Lift the water up. Then, let gravity carry it down. It is an extremely simple principle. But if organized properly, it could create a massive irrigation system. And that may have been one of the secrets that made the Hanging Gardens possible. But how much water would be needed? This is a difficult question. A small garden doesn't need that much. But a massive garden is an entirely different matter. Large trees need water. Small plants need water. The soil loses moisture under the sun. Water evaporates. Roots absorb it. And in a hot environment, water loss can be extremely high. That means the system would have to operate continuously. Not once, not for one day, but every day. If the garden was truly enormous, the amount of water required could have been tremendous. And this leads to an important conclusion. A project like this could not have depended on just a few gardeners. It would have required an entire system, an army without weapons. Imagine hundreds of people working in the garden. One group collects water, another operates the lifting mechanism, another inspects the channels, another cares for the plants, another makes repairs, another transports soil, another replaces dead trees, all of them working together. They were not soldiers, but if the system stopped, the entire garden could die. That is why these workers may have been just as important as the people who built the structure itself. A wonder is not created only on the day it is completed. It is created every day afterward. What if the Hanging Gardens didn't really hang? The name Hanging Gardens sometimes makes us imagine gardens literally suspended in midair. But perhaps that wasn't what the name actually meant. Maybe the plants grew on architectural terraces. Maybe the levels were built one above another. From a distance, the garden would appear to hang over the city. And when viewed from below, the trees and foliage might have spilled down over the lower terraces. That could have created the impression that the entire garden was floating. But in reality, it would still have been supported by a massive structure beneath it. If so, the Hanging Gardens were not magic. They were a description, a highly visual description from people who had seen something extraordinarily unusual, where architecture meets hydraulics. Imagine the entire structure. At the bottom, the water source. Then, the water lifting mechanism. Above it, the garden terraces. Inside, layers of soil. Around them, retaining walls. Between them, water channels. Above everything, the trees. Water is lifted upward. Then it flows downward. The plants absorb it. Some of the water evaporates, some continues downward, and the system lifts more water again. If we look at the whole thing, it almost becomes a cycle. An artificial system that imitates the movement of water in nature. And what is remarkable is, the ancient builders could have created such a system without understanding scientific concepts the way we do today. They didn't need to know every equation. They only needed to observe, experiment, make mistakes, correct them, and pass their knowledge on. But there is a line between possible and what actually happened. This is where we have to be especially careful. We can establish that. Ancient people knew how to move water. They knew how to build canals. They knew how to use water wheels and lifting mechanisms at different points in history. And they were absolutely capable of organizing labor on a massive scale. But that still isn't enough to prove that the Hanging Gardens actually used the exact system we've just imagined. That is the difference between it could have been done and it was actually done. History does not allow us to turn a reasonable hypothesis into fact simply because it sounds convincing. And that gap is exactly what makes the mystery even more fascinating. Because one piece is still missing. We have the stories, we have the cities, we have irrigation systems, we have ancient technologies, we have images of gardens, we have records of kings, but we are still missing one thing: direct evidence connecting all of them together. A structure that we can point to and say, this is the Hanging Gardens. Until that evidence appears, every theory must remain open. Maybe Babylon is correct. Maybe Nineveh is correct. Maybe both cities played a role in the story. Or perhaps the Hanging Gardens never existed in the form we imagine them at all. But look at what we have learned. Whatever the final answer may be, one thing has become clear. Ancient people did not live in a completely primitive world. They observed nature. They understood the movement of water. They knew how to use slopes. They knew how to build canals. They knew how to transport materials. They knew how to organize labor. And when all of that knowledge was combined, things that seemed impossible became possible. Perhaps this is what we should really call a wonder. Not because ancient people had magic, but because they accomplished things we once believed they were incapable of doing. And there is one final question. If the Hanging Gardens required such a complex water system, then who designed it? An engineer? A group of craftsmen? A hydraulic specialist? Or the king himself? And how could an idea like this have emerged in the ancient world? Because sometimes, behind a wonder, there isn't just a king. There are hundreds of anonymous people. People with no statues, no books telling the stories of their lives, no names remembered by history. People who stood beneath the scorching sun, operating the wheels, carrying water, building channels, transporting soil, planting trees, repairing walls, and repeating the same work every day. They may have created a wonder that thousands of years later, we are still debating whether it ever existed. And perhaps that is the saddest paradox of all. We remember the names of kings, but we may have forgotten the people who actually built the wonders. And if one day we discover definitive evidence of the Hanging Gardens, perhaps what we will see is not simply a garden. We will see the traces of a society, a labor system, a technological tradition, a way of organizing power, and thousands of people who transformed earth, water, and stone into something that would leave future generations in awe. But there is still a greater mystery. If the Hanging Gardens really existed, why is there no single description telling us exactly what they looked like? Why did the people who wrote about them tell different stories? Why does such a famous wonder have such an uncertain history? And could it be that these conflicting accounts are actually hiding the final clue to the true identity of the Hanging Gardens? In the final part, we will bring all the pieces together: Babylon, Nineveh, Nebuchadnezzar, Sennacherib, ancient water systems, and the surviving written records. And from there, we will try to answer the question that has remained unanswered for thousands of years. Did the Hanging Gardens of Babylon really exist? Or is the most famous wonder of the ancient world also one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries? The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, a wonder or an unsolved mystery? Perhaps after everything we've just explored, the final question is no longer simply, did the Hanging Gardens of Babylon really exist? But rather, what do we actually know about them? A garden once ranked among the greatest wonders of the ancient world. A structure said to have had layers of greenery rising above a hot, dry land. A place where water may have been lifted to great heights using techniques that we still struggle to fully imagine today. A structure associated with some of the most powerful kings of Mesopotamia. And yet, after thousands of years, we still cannot point to a specific location and say, this is it. There is no sign, no securely identified foundation, no complete blueprint, no simple inscription that says, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, and that silence has turned them into one of the most enduring mysteries of the ancient world. What we know. Let's begin with what we know with the greatest certainty. Babylon really existed. And not only did it exist, it was once one of the most important cities in the ancient world, a center of power, a center of culture, a city filled with enormous architectural achievements, walls, temples, palaces, famous gates, and one king who transformed Babylon into a symbol of power, Nebuchadnezzar II. He really did build and expand Babylon. That is not legend, that is history. We also know that the ancient Mesopotamians were capable of constructing sophisticated irrigation systems. They knew how to control water. They knew how to build canals. They knew how to use flowing water. They knew how to transform dry land into places where crops could grow. And at Nineveh, the Assyrians also left evidence of astonishing engineering capabilities. So if the question is simply, were ancient people capable of building a large garden and supplying it with water? The answer may be yes, but that is not the hardest question. The problem lies in the name itself. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, just 4 words, but every one of them contains a problem. Gardens. Royal gardens may very well have existed. That would fit perfectly within the ancient world. Hanging. It may not have meant that the plants were literally suspended in the air. It could simply have described a garden built on elevated terraces. Babylon. This is where the real debate begins. Because if those famous gardens were actually located at Nineveh, then the name Babylon could be the result of a historical confusion. And if they weren't, then we have to explain why direct evidence at Babylon remains so difficult to find. Theory 1. The Hanging Gardens really were in Babylon. This is the most familiar theory. According to the traditional interpretation, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the construction of a massive garden in Babylon. Some later stories even connect the structure with a queen or with the desire to create a green sanctuary in the middle of a hot, dry land. The image is almost perfect: a powerful king, a legendary city, a multi-level garden, lush trees, water flowing between the terraces, and all of it standing in the scorching landscape of Mesopotamia. It is a story so compelling that it almost feels impossible to let it disappear. And perhaps precisely because it is so compelling, it has survived for thousands of years. But the problem is, direct archaeological evidence is still not strong enough to end the debate. That does not prove the garden never existed, but it does force researchers to remain cautious. Theory 2. Nineveh was the real home of the wonder. This theory is compelling because it contains several particularly interesting pieces of the puzzle. Nineveh had a large-scale irrigation system. Sennacherib was deeply interested in water. He built structures that brought water from distant sources. and there is evidence that royal gardens played an important role in Assyrian architecture. Put all of these pieces together, and a picture begins to emerge. A great city, a powerful king, advanced hydraulic engineering, gardens, and the ability to bring water to higher ground. Perhaps this was where the story of the Hanging Gardens really began. Then, over the centuries, the location changed. The story was retold, and eventually, Nineveh became Babylon in the memory of later generations. If that is true, then it would mean that for centuries we have been searching for a wonder in the wrong city. Theory 3. Perhaps we are looking for something that never existed the way we imagine it. This is the hardest possibility to accept, but it cannot be completely ruled out. Perhaps royal gardens really did exist. Perhaps there were multi-level structures. Perhaps there were sophisticated irrigation systems. Perhaps there were palaces filled with greenery and water. But the image of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon that we know today could be a combination of many different stories. A little Babylon, a little Nineveh, a little from the memories of travelers, a little from the descriptions of historians, and a little imagination. Over time, all of these elements merged into a single wonder. If so, the Hanging Gardens may not have been one single structure. They may have been a collective memory of the great gardens of the ancient world. But that doesn't make the story any less wonderful. Quite the opposite. If there was no single hanging garden, then it means ancient people built enough extraordinary structures for later generations to confuse them with one another. They really did build enormous cities. They really did construct vast water systems. They really did create royal gardens. They really did transport earth, stone, and water through human labor. And they really were capable of transforming harsh landscapes into green spaces. So, whatever the final answer may be, we still cannot deny what they were capable of. Perhaps the most astonishing question isn't, did they build the Hanging Gardens or not? But what else were they capable of building that we still don't fully understand today? A wonder may have been built by people whose names we never knew. Let's return to the people. Not the kings, not the historians, not the names that appear in books, but the workers, the people who dug the earth, the people who fired the bricks, the people who transported materials, the people who built the walls, the people who dug the canals, the people who operated the water lifting systems, the people who planted the trees, the people who maintained the gardens. These people may have worked beneath the scorching sun, day after day, year after year. They may never have known that the structure they were building would one day be called one of the wonders of the world. To them, it was simply work. Another day of labor, another assigned task, another project ordered by the king. But from those ordinary tasks, something extraordinary may have emerged. And then one day, those people disappeared, the kings disappeared, the dynasties disappeared, the cities disappeared. Languages changed, roads were abandoned, canals dried up. Trees died, walls collapsed, bricks were taken away and reused, and eventually, the structure became part of the earth. But the story survived. That is the strange part. A structure can disappear, but the memory of it can remain. A city can be buried, but its name can still be spoken. A king can die thousands of years ago, yet what he built can still make us argue. And perhaps that is why human beings have always been fascinated by the wonders of the ancient world. They remind us that time can destroy stone, but it cannot always destroy a story. So, did the Hanging Gardens really exist? If we were forced to give a simple answer, the most honest answer would be, we still cannot know for certain. We cannot say, it definitely existed, but we also cannot say, it definitely did not. And that is not a failure. That is the nature of history. There are things we know, there are things we can infer, and there are things we can only ask questions about. Where were the Hanging Gardens? Who built them? What did they look like? How did the water system work? Why did they disappear? And were the Hanging Gardens we know today actually a single structure? Those questions remain. But there is a bigger lesson. Perhaps we have focused too much on searching for a structure, a wall, a foundation, a brick bearing a name, a piece of evidence that would allow us to say, this is the Hanging Gardens. But perhaps what matters more is the civilization behind them. A civilization that knew how to move water over long distances. that knew how to organize thousands of people, that knew how to build enormous cities, that knew how to transform dry land into gardens, that knew how to combine architecture with nature, and that knew how to create things that would make people thousands of years later still ask, how did they do it? That may be the true legacy. And perhaps, if one day archaeologists discover the final piece of evidence, if they dig into the earth and uncover a complete foundation system, if an ancient inscription appears, if a structure can finally be identified with certainty, then we will know the answer. But what if that never happens? What if the Hanging Gardens are never found? What if they have disappeared completely? Then the story will still matter, because sometimes a mystery does not exist to be solved. It exists to remind us that the human past is greater than what has survived from it. Thousands of years later, imagine a modern city, skyscrapers, roads filled with traffic, rooftop gardens, automated water pumps, living walls, vertical farms. We look at them and call them modern technology. But now go back in time. More than 2,000 years ago, a person may have stood beneath a multi-level garden, looking up at the trees, listening to the sound of water, watching streams flow from one terrace to another. And perhaps that person also thought, I can't believe human beings were able to do this. Maybe the distance between us and them is not as great as we think. Technology changes, materials change, but one thing remains the same: the human ability to look at a problem and find a way to overcome it. The Hanging Gardens may have disappeared, but the questions they left behind remain. How did people lift water to great heights? How did they build on layers of heavy soil? How did they protect the structure from water? How did they maintain thousands of plants in a hot, dry environment? How could an ancient civilization organize all of this? And finally, how could such a massive wonder disappear almost completely? Perhaps one day we will know, but perhaps that secret has been buried in the earth for too long. And this is what I want you to remember. When you look at paintings of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, don't just look at the trees. Don't just look at the palace. Don't just look at the flowing water. Try looking down. Think about the people who carried every brick, the people who dug every canal, the people who transported every load of soil, the people who lifted every bucket of water, the people who cared for every tree, and the people who spent their entire lives in a world that today we know only through fragments. They may never have known that thousands of years later, people would still talk about what they built, still debate whether it existed, still search for it, and still ask, were the Hanging Gardens real? There are wonders built from stone and then destroyed by time. There are empires that once ruled vast lands, but in the end were reduced to a few lines in the history books. There are cities that were once filled with the sound of human voices, but today all that remains are walls buried beneath the sand. And then there is a garden, one we are not even sure ever existed or where it might have been. Yet that very uncertainty is what has allowed the Hanging Gardens of Babylon to outlive almost any other structure. Because if we knew exactly where it was, the story would be over. If we knew exactly who built it, the mystery would be over. If we knew exactly what it looked like, there would be no room left for imagination. But for now, it is still there, somewhere between history and legend, between Babylon and Nineveh, between evidence and theory, between what we know and what we still cannot explain. Perhaps the Hanging Gardens once rose above Babylon. Perhaps they once flourished in Nineveh. Or perhaps they never existed exactly as we imagine them. But there is one thing we know for certain. Ancient people once dreamed of extraordinary things, and sometimes they even turned those dreams into reality. Perhaps that is the greatest secret of the Hanging Gardens, not that they once hung in the sky, but that there was once a time when people looked upon a barren land and decided to turn it into a garden. Thousands of years have passed, the trees are gone, the water no longer flows, the walls have disappeared. The people who built it have long since returned to the dust. But the question remains, and perhaps, as long as people continue to look at the ruins of the past and wonder, how did they do it? The Hanging Gardens of Babylon have not truly disappeared. They still exist in our imagination. And sometimes, the greatest mysteries of history are not the things we have discovered, but the things we are still searching for. And if you're anything like me, always fascinated by the mysteries that time has failed to solve, the civilizations that disappeared, and the structures we still don't fully understand, then subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because in the videos to come, we'll continue traveling back through time, exploring cities that were buried, civilizations that once stood in glory, and secrets that still lie beneath thousands of years of dust and history. And who knows, maybe one of the mysteries we uncover together next will make you stop and ask, is the history we know really the whole story? If you enjoy stories like this, leave a comment below. Do you think the Hanging Gardens of Babylon really existed in Babylon, in Nineveh? Or were they simply a legend created from a combination of different stories? I really want to know which theory you believe. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. And remember, the past may have disappeared, but its secrets are still there. I'll see you again on our next journey into the mysteries of the past.